I didn't know why I was doing this. Why, at 72, I had decided to leave my quiet home on the Texas plains to venture into a city that I hadn't seen in years. Maybe it was because I could no longer bear the silence that had settled between me and my daughter, Margaret. Or maybe it was because my pride had been shattered one too many times. I felt like an old chair, pushed to the side, forgotten, no longer of use to anyone. And it was Margaret, my only daughter, who had made me feel like nothing more than an inconvenience. The early morning sun cast a soft glow over the dusty roads as I packed my things into an old suitcase that had seen better days. It wasn't a long trip to the city, but the unknown stretched before me like the desert horizon. I'd never thought I'd have to do this. I'd never thought I'd have to seek answers, to demand something from the woman I raised. But this was what it had come to. The car hummed along, its engine old but reliable, just like me. I passed fields that once felt familiar, but now they seemed like distant memories, far away from this city I was about to enter, where everything was shiny and new, and nobody had time to look back at the past. My past. My life. It didn't matter anymore. Not to them. I arrived at the outskirts of the city, a place that had once been home for my children. The house where they grew up was now a monstrosity, 3 stories high, towering over the little neighborhood that used to be. The city had swallowed up the old Texas I knew, replaced it with high-rise buildings and streets full of people who walked past you without a second glance. I took a deep breath and pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed through the emptiness, and I could almost hear my heart pounding in my chest. No welcoming "Mom" or "Hey Mary, long time no see." No hugs, no kisses, just the faint sound of footsteps from behind the door. The door creaked open, and there she stood, Margaret. She looked different somehow. More polished maybe, but still my daughter. But there was no warmth in her eyes. No smile. Just a cold, unreadable expression. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice flat, not even a hint of surprise. I could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, suffocating me. I had expected something else, something warmer, something that would have felt like home. But there was none of that. Only a distant stranger standing before me. "I thought I'd come by," I said, my voice shaking. "I brought a gift for little Jason. I thought." "Not now, Mom," she interrupted. Her face twisted slightly as she looked at me, as if I were an inconvenience she had to deal with. "We don't need anything right now." I held the box with the small toy for my grandson tightly in my hands, realizing in that moment that it was pointless. They didn't need me. They didn't even want me here. It was just a formality. A gesture. The same gesture I had made 1,000 times before, and the same rejection I had come to expect. Margaret didn't even take the box. Instead, her husband, Richard, appeared in the doorway, his presence looming. His gaze was cool, dismissive. "She's here, isn't she?" he said, his tone more of an observation than a greeting. Without a word, he stepped aside, and a few moments later, I was walking down the driveway, a silent exit. No argument, no plea. Just a quiet, unnecessary gesture that left me feeling smaller than I had ever felt before. I wanted to scream, to demand respect, but all I could do was sit in the car and drive away, unsure of where I was headed next. But as I drove, I remembered something that gave me a sense of power. My pension. My savings. My documents. They all meant something now. They had underestimated me. Thought I was just a frail old woman who couldn't fight back. They had no idea what I had been planning. I wasn't just an old lady, no. I was more than that. And this time I would make sure they knew it. I sat at the table in my small kitchen, the one light on the wall casting shadows across the papers in front of me. The ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, a steady reminder that time was moving, and with it, everything was shifting. The cup of tea beside me had long since gone cold, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. My hands, steady and unshaken, hovered over the papers. Everything was in order. Everything except for what had to come next. All I had to do was make one phone call. That was it. Just one call and everything would change. I could stay quiet. I could go back to my little house on the plains and pretend none of this happened. Pretend that being cast out of my own daughter's life didn't hurt as much as it did. But I knew deep down that I couldn't. Not this time. I wasn't running. Not anymore. I reached for the phone, my fingers brushing over the familiar number that had been burned into my memory. This was the same number I had dialed 3 years ago when I signed all those papers, Papers that tied me to the Woods family, papers that made me feel like I was still part of something still needed. My hands didn't tremble, even though this was the kind of call no one ever wanted to make. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't the woman they had cast aside. I was Mary McGill, and I had finally found my voice. I dialed the number, and the phone rang just once before it was picked up. "Good day, this is Lisbeth Woods from the Sun Circle Bank. How may I assist you?" came the calm, polite voice on the other end. She sounded like any other banker, the type who dealt with paperwork and loans all day, oblivious to the gravity of what was about to unfold. "Good day, Lisbeth." I began, my voice steady, my words careful. "This is Mary McGill, the co-signer on the mortgage loan for the Woods family. I need to notify you of some changes." There was a brief silence on the other end. I could hear the soft clicking of keys as Lisbeth typed something into her computer, processing my words. I knew exactly how this conversation would play out. The family I had helped, the family I had sacrificed for, was no longer my responsibility. My daughter, my son-in-law, had made that clear. And now it was time for me to make it clear to the bank. "Your family, my daughter, her husband, and I. We have a good reputation at the bank," I continued, my tone unwavering. "But I must withdraw my support." Another pause. I could hear Lisbeth's quiet intake of breath. The weight of my words hung in the air between us. This wasn't just a change in paperwork. This was a final severing of ties. I wasn't backing out of this decision. It was done. I'm sorry, Mrs. McGill, but this is a very serious matter. Are you sure you want to officially withdraw your guarantee?" Lisbeth's voice had taken on a more cautious tone, and I could feel her hesitation. She wasn't used to dealing with family matters like this, I could tell. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm sure. The Woods family no longer has my support. If you would like, I can explain the details, but this is my final decision." There was more quiet, more typing. I could tell she was trying to process what I was saying, trying to understand why a woman would sever a bond this deep. It wasn't just money at stake. It was my pride, my self-respect, and the years I spent sacrificing for a family that had forgotten me the moment I was no longer useful to them. After a few more minutes, Lisbeth confirmed the withdrawal, and we concluded the call. I didn't feel a need for drama or fanfare. This wasn't about revenge or anger. It was simply about justice. My decision was made, and I could feel the weight lift from my chest as if I had finally unclasped a long-forgotten burden. They had thought I was weak, that I was just an old woman with no fight left in me. But I had more strength in my little finger than they ever gave me credit for. I sat back in my chair, letting the silence fill the room. The papers in front of me were no longer important. The decisions had been made, the die had been cast, and I was no longer a part of their fake world. They had cast me aside, but now it was time for them to feel the consequences. They hadn't yet realized what I had done, but they would soon. I stood up slowly, my joints creaking with the effort, and walked over to the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. The view outside was nothing but open sky, just like the future ahead of me. A future that was finally mine to shape, to live for myself. I wasn't going to chase them anymore. I wasn't going to beg for scraps of attention or approval. No, this time it was their turn to understand what it felt like to lose everything. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I couldn't help but smile, not with joy but with a quiet satisfaction. Things had finally balanced out. The scales had tipped and I had come out on top. This was just the beginning. What they didn't know was that their world was about to shift. Slowly but surely. The consequences of their actions were just starting to unfold, and I would be there to watch every moment of it. I sat in the same old chair by the window, the soft evening light filtering through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. The house, quiet as it always was, seemed to echo with the stillness that had become so familiar to me over the years. But then the phone rang again. I glanced down at the screen and there it was, Charlotta's name. The second call of the day. The first time she had called, I didn't pick up. I wasn't ready to hear her apologies, her excuses. Not yet. Not when the wound was still so fresh. But now, as I sat there, I could feel the weight of the moment. I couldn't run from this any longer. It was time. I took a deep breath and answered the call. "Mamo, this is Charlotta. I got a letter from the bank. What did you do?" Her voice trembled, a mix of frustration and fear slipping through the words. I let her words hang in the air for a moment before I responded, my voice calm, steady. I did what I had to do. You thought I would always be your unshakable support. But it turns out I was just a convenient link in your plans. There was silence on the other end, and I could almost hear the realization sinking in. She wasn't expecting this. She wasn't expecting me to finally stand up for myself. Mamo, don't do this. You don't understand. We won't be able to keep the house without your help. We'll lose everything, she pleaded, her voice now desperate, the cracks of panic creeping through. I gripped the armrests of the chair, my fingers digging into the worn fabric. It was strange how much power a few simple words could carry. The weight of them settled over me, not as a burden, but as something I had been waiting to say for so long. Charlotta, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I'm not the one destroying everything. You decided I was only useful as long as I didn't get in the way of your perfect little world. The moment you chose your own convenience over family, you lost me. I could feel the shift in the air. The power was now in my hands and I wasn't giving it back. There was a long pause on the other end. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. But you don't want us to lose everything, do you? I closed my eyes, letting her words roll over me. This was it, the final attempt at manipulation. The final shackle she hoped would keep me tied to her. But I had already broken free. You're already losing everything, Charlotta, I replied, my words cold, cutting through the distance between us. I can't be your safety net anymore. Not when you treat me like this. And by the way, you didn't just lose me. You lost my support too. I heard her gasp, but I didn't wait for her response. I didn't need to hear her excuses or apologies. Instead, I ended the call, hanging up the phone with a sense of finality. The room was silent now, too silent. The kind of silence that settles deep inside your bones. But it wasn't painful. It wasn't the silence of regret or sorrow. No, this was a calm, steady silence, one that spoke of clarity. I knew I'd made the right decision. I had been there for her. For all of them. I had sacrificed so much time, energy, resources, all for them. And how had they repaid me? By tossing me aside when I no longer fit into their plans. Now it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. I didn't need any more explanations or justifications. I had done enough. I had given enough. And now they would have to navigate the world they had built without my help. The night deepened and I sat in the chair, my hands resting on the arms, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. I didn't cry. I didn't feel regret. I simply felt calm. Charlotta and her husband, Mark, still hadn't realized what they had lost. But they would. They would soon understand. The decisions they had made, thinking they could use me, treat me like a tool, an ATM, a convenient resource, those decisions would come back to haunt them. They hadn't just lost my financial support. They had lost me. And that, in the end, would be the hardest blow to bear. I glanced out the window, watching as the sun sank lower in the sky, casting a soft orange glow across the horizon. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but I knew it would be different. My world, my life was finally mine again. I wasn't part of their mess anymore. And as I sat there, listening to the silence, I smiled, not with joy, but with a sense of quiet satisfaction. For the first time in years, I was in control. And that, in itself, was a victory. 3 days had passed since the call with Charlotta, and I found myself sitting at the kitchen table once more, surrounded by the piles of documents I had carefully gone over time and again. Everything in front of me had been sorted, organized, checked, and double-checked. I didn't need any more reasons to second-guess myself. I knew what I had done, and I knew it was the only path forward. Anything I postponed, anything I let slip, would only serve as a reminder of how I had failed before. And this time I would not allow myself to fail. Not again. The weight of the last few days still pressed on me, but there was a sense of calm too. A finality that I had never allowed myself to feel before. I wasn't just making decisions for myself anymore. I was carving out a future free from the constraints they had built around me, and there was no turning back. Then the phone rang. I didn't have to look at the screen to know who it was. Charlotta. Her name flashed across the display, and for a brief moment, I considered ignoring it. But something in the air, something in the stillness of the room, told me that I needed to take this call. It was inevitable after all. I answered, my voice steady, knowing full well that whatever was to come, I had already made up my mind. Mamo, I understand what you're doing. I see now. You want us to lose everything, don't you? Her voice was different now, softer, hesitant, almost fragile. There was none of the sharpness or anger that had colored her tone just a few days ago. But the pain, the hurt was still there. It was in the way her words trembled, as if she were standing on the edge of something she couldn't control. I paused for a moment, letting her words settle. But my response came without hesitation. You're not losing anything, Charlotta. You lost me long ago when you decided that I was only useful as long as I could provide for your needs, I said, my voice cool, without malice. It wasn't a condemnation, it was just the truth. Her silence on the other end spoke volumes. It was as if she hadn't expected this, hadn't expected me to be so resolute, so unshaken. But the truth was, I had given her and her family everything I had for so long, and in return, I had received nothing but neglect and manipulation. I talked to Thomas, she said, her voice faltering for a moment. Maybe you'll change your mind. Please, Mamo, don't do this. I squeezed my eyes shut for a brief moment, but the resolve in me was unshakable. This was the last attempt at pulling me back into their web, the final plea to keep me tethered to the life I had been living under their control. But I knew what I had to do. If you think I'll back down just to make things easier for you, you're wrong. I won't be your convenience, Charlotta. You made your choice, and now it's your responsibility. You chose this path, and now I cannot be a part of your fake, shallow world. This is the end, I replied, my voice firm, almost final. There was another pause, this one even longer than the last. Then, in a whisper that carried more regret than anything else, she spoke. But you're not really going to let us lose everything, are you? Please, Mamo, we need you. I felt the weight of her words, the desperation in them, but I didn't falter. No, I couldn't falter. I couldn't let her manipulate me anymore. You've already lost everything, Charlotta. The moment you decided to make me a tool for your convenience, I was lost to you. I'm not your backup anymore, and I never will be. Goodbye. And with that, I ended the call. The silence that followed was deafening. It was almost as if the entire world had paused, just for a moment, to acknowledge the weight of what had just happened. There were no more explanations, no more justifications. It was done. And I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. But there was more to do. There was always more. I pulled the last document toward me, the bank's mortgage statement for the Woods family, the same document that I had signed 3 years ago, when I had pledged my support to them, thinking that I was helping my daughter build a better life. Now it sat before me, a symbol of my mistake, a symbol of everything I had given to them, only to have it tossed aside when they no longer found it convenient. This time I wasn't just looking at numbers and signatures. This time I was looking at my own liberation. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. I had come this far, and there was no turning back. I had already taken the first step, and now I had to finish what I started. I picked up the phone again, my fingers moving with a calm certainty. I dialed the bank's number, and when the line clicked, I spoke clearly, but with the unwavering authority I had found in myself. I need to notify you that I can no longer serve as the financial guarantor for the Woods family's mortgage, I said, each word carefully chosen. Please make sure this is processed immediately. The woman on the other end of the line sounded surprised, but I could hear the professionalism in her voice as she began to process the request. Certainly, Mrs. McGill. I'll need to verify some information, but we will take care of this for you. I didn't need to explain further. There was no need. I had made my decision and it was final. I could hear the clacking of keys, the quiet hum of the office as the request was entered, and then the confirmation came. Your request has been processed. The Woods family will no longer have your financial support, the woman said, her voice polite, though I could sense the weight of the matter. I thanked her, hanging up the phone with a sense of completion. The phone call had been short, almost routine, but it had carried a weight that no one would fully understand, not even Charlotta. I sat back in my chair, staring at the document in front of me. The next few days, perhaps weeks, would bring their own challenges. Charlotta and Thomas wouldn't understand what I had done. Not yet. They would panic. They would scramble. They would try to find a way out of the hole they had dug for themselves, but it would be too late. I had made my decision. They had to live with the consequences. The last thing I did that night was pull the blinds closed, letting the darkness fill the room. The silence enveloped me, and for the first time in a long time I felt free. This was my life now. No more excuses. No more living for anyone else. And I had finally made peace with that. The next morning I woke up early, the sunlight barely rising above the horizon. The room was bathed in soft light, but even the warmth of the sun couldn't melt the cold inside me. I sat at the kitchen table, where the air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, and stared down into my empty cup. The decision had already been made, and now all that remained was waiting. Waiting for what? I wasn't sure. The consequences? The fallout? The inevitable collapse of the life they had built on the foundation of my sacrifices? All of it felt like a long time coming, like a tidal wave that had been building for years, and now it was finally reaching the shore. But the truth was, I wasn't scared. I wasn't even anxious anymore. I had already taken the step that needed to be taken. Hours later, the phone rang again. I glanced at the screen. It was the bank. They were calling to discuss the change in the mortgage guarantee, and even though I had known this was coming, the reality of it still sent a small shiver down my spine. I wasn't just closing a chapter. I was rewriting the entire story. The call was brief, polite, but to the point. They requested that I come to the branch to finalize the changes. I agreed without hesitation. I wasn't surprised by their serious tone. After all, what I had done wasn't something that could be easily ignored. I knew this was only the beginning. I also knew that Charlotta and Thomas were still in the dark about the full extent of what was happening. They couldn't see the avalanche coming. As I walked into the bank, I immediately noticed the difference in atmosphere. The staff seemed more alert, more aware of the gravity of the situation. They had prepared for this. They had already seen what was coming, what would happen next. The manager of the risk department was waiting for me, a sharp-eyed man who looked as if he had dealt with situations like mine before. He nodded when I entered, and without wasting time, we got straight to the business at hand. As I signed the final paperwork to officially remove myself as a guarantor for the mortgage, I felt the weight of it all settle in. Your actions, Mrs. McGill, are a significant step. We will need to take the necessary precautions to protect the bank from any risk, the manager said as I finished signing. I simply nodded in response. There was no need to explain further. I already knew what would follow. I didn't need their sympathy or understanding. I had already made my choice. When I left the bank, my heart was pounding. It wasn't fear, it was something else. Something thrilling. My hands were steady, and there was a strange calm in my chest as I realized the enormity of what I had just done. This wasn't just about cutting ties with Charlotta and Thomas. This was about finally taking back my life. About claiming my own power. For the next few days, I watched as things began to unravel for them. They were still scrambling, still trying to hold on to the pieces of their seemingly perfect life. But it was clear that their world was no longer stable. The cracks had started to show. Charlotta and Thomas began calling various banks, attempting to find a solution, trying to salvage what they could from the mess they were now in. But nothing worked. They needed me, and without my signature, they were facing an insurmountable wall. It wasn't just a financial crisis, it was a moral one too. They had ignored the foundation that had supported them, thinking they could live without it. Now they were realizing just how wrong they were. Charlotta called me several times, but I didn't pick up. I had no intention of listening to her apologies, her manipulative words. I had heard it all before. Her desperate pleas were now just signals that their fortress was crumbling. They were panicking, and I was no longer the lifeline they could call on when everything went wrong. Days passed, and soon I learned that Charlotta and Thomas had started selling off their things. Desperate to come up with the money to cover the mortgage, they sold their possessions one by one. Their luxurious home, with its high fences and perfectly manicured lawn, no longer felt so untouchable. It had turned into a trap, one of their own making. For me, this wasn't just satisfaction. It was confirmation that they had finally understood what they had taken for granted for so long. Their grand facade had cracked, and now they were facing the reality of their decisions. By the time they called again, it was clear that their situation was dire. But this time I didn't take the call with any hesitation. I had already made my decision, and there was nothing left to explain. When Charlotta spoke, I could hear the defeat in her voice, the resignation she hadn't had before. "Memo," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading. "Please. I know we made a mistake. Can't you help us? Just this once." I let her words hang in the air, but I didn't respond right away. When I did, my voice was steady, without a trace of emotion. "I've already helped you, Charlotta," I said, my words cutting through the static of the phone line. "And you chose your path. You chose to live the way you did. And now it's your responsibility. I can't be your crutch anymore. You've lost me and you've lost my support. I'm not part of your world anymore." She was silent for a moment, and I could feel her trying to grasp at something, anything to change my mind. But I didn't give her that chance. I had already said everything I needed to say. The call ended, and as I sat there in the quiet, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. I had done it. I had cut the ties, closed the door, and moved on. No more apologies. No more begging. No more being a tool for their convenience. In the days that followed, I watched from the sidelines as Charlotta and Thomas tried to pick up the pieces of their broken world. They were forced to sell off their possessions, and I knew that soon the house would be gone too. They would have to face the consequences of their choices, just like I had faced the consequences of my own life. But unlike them, I wouldn't be stuck in the ruins of what had been. I had chosen freedom, and that, for the first time in many years, felt like a victory. A week had passed since I made my decision, and their world continued to fall apart. It wasn't my problem anymore, and the more I thought about it, the less I cared. Charlotta had tried calling every day, but I never picked up. I had disconnected my phone from anyone who wasn't a part of my real life, the one I was starting to rebuild without them. I could feel their desperation from miles away. I knew exactly what they were doing, what they were trying. They were still searching for a way to fix the situation, still trying to find a magic solution to salvage what they had lost. But pride, as always, would be their greatest obstacle. From the moment I had informed the bank about withdrawing my guarantee, everything had changed. I could almost feel the tectonic plates shifting under their feet as they scrambled to keep their towering house from collapsing. The day I heard their home had been officially listed for sale, I knew that it was only the beginning. Soon, someone else would be walking through the rooms, sitting at the table, living in the life that once seemed unbreakable. I didn't feel sympathy, though. I had no regrets. In fact, I felt a strange sense of peace as I watched them fumble. Their desire to live a life of luxury, of appearances, had backfired. They had ignored my help, my role in their lives, and now they were paying for it. Their phone calls became more urgent, their voices filled with panic, but I didn't take the calls. I didn't need to hear their pleas. I could hear the stress in their voices, the cracks starting to show as they realized the extent of the mess they had made. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had lived their lives trying to impress others, showing off their shiny cars, their expensive furniture, their perfect home. Now they were forced to sell those same things, everything they had worked so hard to build just to keep up with the Joneses. Their lives, which they had once shown off so proudly, were now falling apart like cheap cardboard. The day I found out they had started auctioning off their cars and furniture, I felt satisfied. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was the feeling that I had been right all along. I had known this would happen. Their ambition, their sense of entitlement, their blindness to the reality of their own actions, it had all led to this. I remained in my small house, the place I had called home for so many years. Nothing had changed here, except for the peace that seemed to flow through every room. There was something almost sacred about the stillness that filled this place. It was as though everything had fallen into its rightful place. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was just content. It was the kind of quiet that only comes when you know you've done what was necessary. But then, in the middle of this calm, Charlotta called again. It was different this time, though. I knew it. She wasn't calling to ask for money. She wasn't calling to make more empty promises. No, this time she was calling because she had no other choice. I didn't answer immediately. The phone rang a few times, then silence. I waited. It was time. Finally, I picked up. "Mamo, please." Charlotta's voice was small, broken. She was no longer the woman who had cast me aside like an inconvenience. Now there was vulnerability in her words, the cracks of her polished facade breaking apart with every syllable. I stayed quiet for a moment. Her voice wasn't what it used to be, sharp, demanding. Now it was soft, pleading, desperate. I could hear the weight of their reality pressing in on her, and for a moment, I almost felt a flicker of something inside me. A hesitation perhaps. But it passed quickly. I know what you've done, and I know what you're thinking. But please, Mamo, this is more than we can bear. We're at the edge and I just don't know what to do anymore, she said, her voice thick with what I could only assume was shame. I took a deep breath. Charlotta, you knew what would happen when I withdrew my support. You knew this day would come. There was a long pause and then I heard her voice crack. But you don't understand. You can't possibly know how hard this is for us. You don't know what we've been through. You've taken away everything. And now we don't have a way out. I felt a strange stillness in me. Was I supposed to feel pity? Was I supposed to cave in and give them another chance? I had done enough. I had given them everything I could, and they had thrown it all away. I don't need to understand, Charlotta. I've seen enough. I've given enough. You're responsible for your choices, just as I am responsible for mine. I'm not your backup anymore. You've lost me. My voice was calm, almost detached, but beneath that calm, I felt a sense of finality that I hadn't experienced before. This was the end. There were no more chances. Mamo, please. You can't just leave us like this, she pleaded. Her words were desperate now, more frantic. I was silent for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air. The silence between us was thick, suffocating. For the first time, I truly understood the weight of everything. She had made her choices, and now she had to face them. It wasn't my responsibility anymore to carry their weight. I had been carrying it for too long. I can, Charlotta. I already have. And with that, I ended the call. The silence that followed felt almost like a physical thing, pressing in on me. I sat there holding the phone in my hand, staring at the screen as if it would give me some clue about the future. But there was nothing left to figure out. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when I could finally let go. It wasn't easy. It wasn't painless. But I knew I had done the right thing. They had made their bed. Now they would lie in it. And I would move on, quietly, peacefully, knowing that I had reclaimed my life from the wreckage they had left behind. The next few days passed quietly, like the calm after a storm, and I found solace in the stillness. I had cut myself off completely from the outside world, choosing not to engage with anyone, least of all Charlotta and Thomas. I knew they were still trying, still grasping for some way to salvage what remained, but I had no interest in listening to their apologies, their excuses, or their pleas for help. What was done. Everything had been decided, and I had made my peace with it. I felt no guilt, no remorse. In fact, I felt a strange satisfaction in the way things had unfolded. But as I sat alone day after day with only my thoughts for company, there was a deeper realization growing within me. I had made them pay for their mistakes, yes, but now it was time for me to finish this. It wasn't enough that they would suffer the consequences. I needed to take the final step and solidify my own power in a way that no one could take from me again. It was time for them to see the world from my perspective, the perspective of someone who had once been invisible and was no longer willing to be. On Friday morning, as I sat on my porch sipping hot coffee, the crisp air fresh and clean around me, I saw the first rays of the sun begin to spill over the horizon. Everything felt serene, but deep inside, there was a flicker of something else. It wasn't excitement or joy. It was something quieter, something like strength. And it was that strength that allowed me to read the letter when it arrived, knowing what it would contain before I even opened it. It was from the bank, confirming everything I had already expected. The letter detailed how Clause 17B had been applied to the mortgage agreement, signaling that the balance on the loan was now due immediately. They had no possibility of refinancing or securing a new loan. The house that had been the symbol of their success, of their pride, was on the verge of being sold to cover the debt. I didn't need to read it more than once. I had anticipated this outcome, but still, seeing the words in black and white, seeing the finality of it, made something inside me shift. I had not just deprived them of financial support, I had shown them the real meaning of power. It wasn't in what you owned or how much you had. It was in your ability to make your own decisions, to stand firm when others tried to walk all over you. The house, once their fortress, was now a liability, a burden they could no longer bear. And it was no longer my problem. A small, satisfied smile crept onto my face as I sat back in my chair, the wind rustling the pages of the letter on my lap. I had done what I needed to do, and now they would have to face the consequences of their choices. 2 days later, as expected, Charlotta called again. This time, though, her voice was different. The usual arrogance, the demanding tone was gone. Instead, there was a quiet desperation, an almost resigned sadness that seemed to weigh heavily on her every word. "Mamo, everything you've done, we can't undo it now," she began, her voice low, softer than I had ever heard it. "We've lost everything, but I know deep down that you did what you thought was best. I wish I could have seen that earlier." I listened in silence, hearing the crack in her voice. The words were almost too honest, too raw. She wasn't trying to manipulate me anymore. She wasn't asking for anything. There was nothing but the sound of someone who had realized their mistake, and who now had to live with the weight of it. I took a deep breath. "Charlotta, you always knew what I was doing for you. I never asked for anything in return, but you kept taking, and never once thought about how that was affecting me. You chose your path, and now you have to walk it alone." Her silence was heavier than any words she could have said. The phone line crackled softly as I continued, my voice unwavering. "I loved you, Charlotta, always, but this was a lesson you needed to learn. A lesson in not taking everything for granted. And now you have to build your life on your own terms. You are responsible for what comes next." The quiet on the other end of the line was deafening. It was the kind of silence that follows a great realization, an understanding that can never be taken back. I felt no anger, no hatred, only calm. I can't keep doing this, Mamo," she finally whispered. I don't know where to go from here." I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what had to happen now. She needed to feel this, she needed to understand the weight of the choices she'd made. And in that silence, I knew she was finally getting it. "You've already lost everything, Charlotta," I said quietly. "But this is your chance to rebuild, to be who you really are without relying on others. It's your responsibility now. Don't ever forget that." With that, I ended the call. I set the phone down slowly, the weight of the conversation sinking in. I had no illusions left. The woman on the other end of the line was not the woman who had used me for so long. She was something else now, broken, yes, but finally aware. And that was all I needed. The next few days were quiet. I didn't hear from Charlotta again, and honestly I didn't expect to. She had nothing left to say. They had lost everything, and nothing could undo that. But I wasn't bothered by it. I didn't feel relief or joy. I felt something far more satisfying. Peace. I had fought for years to keep my family close, to stay involved, to offer support when they needed it. But now I had finally learned to let go. To let go of the people who had drained me, who had used me. I had reclaimed my power, and now I could walk through life without being held back by their expectations. As the evening fell, I stood by my window, looking at the stars beginning to appear in the sky. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I had done what was necessary, not just for me but for them too. I was no longer the weak old woman they had treated like an afterthought. I was a force to be reckoned with, and now I stood alone but stronger than ever. And that strength, that was something they would never take from me again.